After refusing to loan my daughter-in-law $100,000 for plastic surgery, she started a living hell in my life. She constantly threw food scraps at me. But when I decided to fight back, I made her beg for forgiveness publicly. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought I'd be sitting in my own kitchen at 64 years old, wondering how my family had become my enemy. The coffee in my hands had gone cold an hour ago, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows of the house where I'd lived for 37 years. The house where I'd raised Brian, the house where Harold and I had planned to grow old together. Harold had been gone 3 years now, and I thought the worst pain was behind me. I was wrong. It started 6 weeks ago on a Tuesday evening. Brian had called asking if he and Melissa could come over for dinner. Nothing unusual about that since Harold's passing. These family dinners had become our routine, a way to stay connected. I'd made Harold's favorite pot roast, set the dining room table with the good china, and even bought a bottle of wine I couldn't really afford on my fixed income. They arrived 20 minutes late, which was typical for Melissa. She swept in, wearing a designer coat I recognized from a boutique window downtown, the kind with a price tag that made my pension check look like pocket change. Brian followed behind her, carrying their usual offering, a store-bought dessert with the price sticker still attached. "Sharon, darling," Melissa said, kissing the air near my cheek. "Something smells wonderful." I'd been Melissa's mother-in-law for 8 years, and she'd never once called me Mom. Always Sharon, always with that particular tone that made my name sound like an inconvenience. Dinner conversation was strained. Melissa picked at her food, commenting on the salt content and asking if I'd used organic vegetables. Brian seemed distracted, checking his phone every few minutes. I tried to fill the silence with questions about their work, their recent vacation to Cabo, anything to maintain the pretense that we were a family sharing a meal. "Actually, Mom," Brian said, as I was clearing the plates, "we wanted to talk to you about something important." I should have known. The formal tone, the careful setup, the way Melissa suddenly became animated, sitting forward in her chair with her hands clasped like she was about to deliver good news. "What is it, honey?" I asked, though something in my stomach was already tightening. Brian glanced at Melissa, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Well, Melissa has been dealing with some self-esteem issues lately. You know how important confidence is in her line of work." Melissa works as a real estate agent for luxury properties, though I'd never been entirely clear on how successful she actually was. She spent more time talking about her career than actually working, as far as I could tell. "I've been feeling so self-conscious," Melissa added, her voice taking on that breathy, vulnerable quality she used when she wanted something. "It's affecting everything. My work, my relationship with Brian, my overall happiness." I nodded sympathetically, though I wasn't sure where this was heading. "Have you considered talking to someone? A counselor, maybe?" Melissa's laugh was sharp. "Oh, Sharon, therapy is so old-fashioned. What I need is something more concrete." That's when Brian dropped the bomb. "She wants to get some cosmetic procedures done, a few surgeries to help her feel more confident." The way he said it, so casual, like he was talking about getting the car serviced. I set down the plate I was holding and looked at them both. "Surgeries?" I asked. "Nothing major," Melissa said quickly. "A breast augmentation, a tummy tuck, maybe a little work around my eyes, some liposuction. Very common procedures these days." I'd seen enough television to know these weren't minor procedures. They were serious surgeries that required weeks of recovery and carried real risks. "The thing is," Brian continued, and here it comes, "our insurance doesn't cover cosmetic surgery, and the total cost would be around $100,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $100,000, my entire annual income before taxes, the amount Harold and I had saved over 40 years of marriage, scrimping and planning for emergencies and retirement. That's a lot of money," I said carefully. "We were hoping," Melissa said, leaning forward with those big brown eyes that Brian had fallen for, "that you might consider helping us with a loan. We'd pay you back, of course, with interest." I looked at my son, really looked at him. At 42 years old, Brian had Harold's honest face, but none of his practical sense. He was looking at me with hopeful expectation, like a child asking for a toy he couldn't afford. "Brian," I said slowly. You know my financial situation. I'm living on your father's pension and Social Security. That money you're talking about, that's my security. But you have the house, Melissa said, her tone becoming sharper. You could take out a home equity loan, or we could arrange something with your investments. How did she know about my investments? I'd never discussed my finances with her, barely discussed them with Brian, but Melissa had a way of extracting information, filing away details for future use. Melissa, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I can't risk my financial security. At my age, I can't afford to take on debt or gamble with my savings. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Melissa's expression shifted from hopeful to cold in an instant. So, you're saying no, she said flatly. I'm saying I can't afford to help with something like this. If there was a medical emergency, if you needed help with something essential. This is essential, Melissa interrupted. You have no idea what it's like to feel uncomfortable in your own skin. To look in the mirror and hate what you see. I thought about the mornings I'd stood in front of my bathroom mirror since Harold died, seeing an old woman staring back at me, seeing loneliness and grief written in every line. But I didn't say that. I understand this is important to you, I said, but I simply can't take on that kind of financial risk. Brian was staring at his hands, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. Melissa stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is unbelievable, she said, her voice rising. You're sitting on all this money, living alone in this huge house, and you can't help your own family. Melissa, please, Brian started, but she cut him off. No, Brian, your mother obviously cares more about her bank account than her son's happiness, than our marriage. That stung. That's not fair, Melissa, isn't it? You have enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life, and you won't share it with the people who actually care about you. I do care about you both. That's why I can't risk what ending up in a slightly smaller house, having to actually budget your grocery shopping. Welcome to how the rest of us live, Sharon. The contempt in her voice was like a slap. I felt my cheeks burning, my hands starting to shake. I think you should leave, I said quietly. Melissa grabbed her purse and coat. Come on, Brian, your mother has made her priorities very clear. Brian finally looked up at me, and I saw disappointment in his eyes. Not at Melissa's behavior, but at mine. My own son was disappointed that I wouldn't bankrupt myself for his wife's vanity. Mom, he said, maybe you could just think about it. We don't need an answer tonight. But I knew my answer wouldn't change. Harold and I had worked too hard, saved too carefully to throw it all away on cosmetic surgery. Good night, Brian, I said. They left without another word, the front door closing with a finality that seemed to echo through the empty house. Stood in my dining room looking at the abandoned desert still in its plastic container and wondered how I'd become the villain in my own family's story. That was 6 weeks ago. I thought the worst part was over. I thought maybe they'd cool down, realize I was being practical, not cruel. I thought we'd find a way past this. I had no idea what Melissa was capable of. I had no idea that refusing to enable her vanity would turn my life into a nightmare. I had no idea that my quiet, comfortable existence was about to become a war zone, but I was about to learn exactly what kind of woman my son had married, and she was about to learn exactly what kind of woman had raised him. The first incident happened 3 days after that disastrous dinner. I was watering my rose bushes, the ones Harold had planted for our 20th anniversary, when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the garden gate, I saw Melissa's white BMW parked behind my old Honda. She didn't come to the front door. Instead, she walked directly to my fence line and dumped a bag of what looked like kitchen scraps onto my freshly planted flower bed, coffee grounds, orange peels, and something that smelled like rotten fish scattered across the marigolds I'd put in just last week. Oops, she called out when she saw me watching. How clumsy of me. Then she got back in her car and drove away, leaving me standing there with my garden hose, watching $20 worth of flowers drowning in garbage. I told myself it was an accident. Melissa could be thoughtless, but she wasn't cruel. At least that's what I wanted to believe. The next morning, I found my garbage cans overturned in the driveway, trash scattered across the lawn and into the street. Mrs. Peterson from next door was already outside with a broom, helping clean up the mess. Sharon, she said, shaking her head, These raccoons are getting so bold. This is the third house on our street this week. I nodded and thanked her for helping. But as I picked up coffee filters and empty soup cans, I noticed something odd. The garbage was only from my cans. Mrs. Peterson's, sitting just 10 feet away, were untouched. So were the Hendersons across the street. Very selective raccoons, I thought. That afternoon, Brian called. His voice was strained, formal. Mom, I heard about your garbage situation. Melissa mentioned seeing the mess when she drove by this morning. Drove by? I asked. Why was she in my neighborhood? A pause. She had a showing nearby. Real estate. You know how it is. I didn't know of any houses for sale in my area, but I didn't push. It's fine, honey. These things happen. Maybe you should consider getting better lids for your cans or storing them in the garage. I'd had the same garbage cans for 15 years. They'd never been overturned before, but I agreed to look into it because what else could I say? That I suspected his wife of vandalizing my property over a loan I couldn't afford to give. The third incident made it clear this wasn't random. I was in my kitchen Thursday morning, making coffee and watching the morning news, when I heard a splashing sound from outside. Through my window, I saw Melissa standing in my backyard, dumping what looked like a container of orange juice onto my patio furniture. This time, she saw me watching. This time, she smiled. I rushed outside, my bathrobe flapping around my legs, but by the time I reached the back door, she was already walking toward the side gate. Melissa, what are you doing? She turned, all innocence and confusion. Oh, Sharon, I was just bringing by some fresh juice for you. The container slipped. I'm so sorry. The spilled juice was sticky and attracting flies already. It would stain the cushions on my outdoor furniture. The set Harold and I had saved up 2 by 5 years ago. You could have knocked, I said, trying to keep my voice level. I didn't want to wake you. You seemed so tired lately. Her eyes glittered with something I couldn't quite name. I hope you're taking care of yourself. Stress can be so aging. After she left, I stood in my ruined backyard and finally admitted what I'd been avoiding. This wasn't coincidence. This was deliberate. Melissa was punishing me for saying no. I called Brian that evening, hoping to talk this through reasonably. Brian, I need to discuss something with you about Melissa. What about her? His tone was already defensive. She's been coming by the house, and there have been some incidents. What kind of incidents? I told him about the garbage, the food scraps, the orange juice. I tried to be fair, to present it as concerning behavior rather than deliberate malice. Mom, that sounds like a series of accidents and misunderstandings, 3 times in 1 week, Brian. Melissa's been really stressed about the surgery situation. Maybe she's just being absent-minded. She dumped orange juice on my patio furniture and then lied about it slipping. Are you sure that's what happened? Maybe you misunderstood. That's when I realized the full scope of what I was dealing with. My son was going to believe his wife no matter what evidence I presented. In his mind, I was the unreasonable one, the stubborn mother who wouldn't help his family and was now making up stories about his innocent wife. Brian, I'm not making this up. I'm not saying you are, Mom. I'm just saying maybe you're interpreting things in the worst possible way, because you're upset about our conversation last week. Upset as if my concern about my life savings was just an emotional overreaction. I think you should apologize to Melissa, he continued. She feels terrible about the accidents and she's hurt that you'd think she was doing this on purpose. I hung up feeling more alone than I had since Harold's funeral. The campaign escalated over the next 2 weeks. Melissa's visits became more frequent and more brazen. She'd show up while I was grocery shopping and leave bags of rotting vegetables in my garden. She'd drive by when I was getting my mail and accidentally splash mud on me from a puddle. The worst was the dog waste. Someone was leaving plastic bags of it on my front steps, always when I was out, always positioned so I'd step in it when I came home. Mrs. Peterson mentioned seeing Melissa's car in the neighborhood around those times, but when I brought it up with Brian, he had explanations. She's been working that area a lot. She's trying to build her client base. Brian, someone is leaving dog feces on my doorstep. Have you considered that it might actually be dogs? Maybe owners who aren't cleaning up properly? I wanted to scream. Instead, I started documenting everything. I wrote down dates and times, took pictures with my phone, and kept a detailed record of each incident. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the evidence was mounting. The breaking point came on a Sunday morning. I'd planned to attend church, something I'd started doing more regularly since Harold passed. As I opened my front door, dressed in my best dress and carrying my purse, I found my car had been vandalized. Not damaged exactly. Melissa was too smart for that, but covered in something that looked like egg whites mixed with flour, creating a thick, gooey mess across the windshield and hood. A note was tucked under the wiper blade. So sorry about the baking accident. Hope this doesn't inconvenience you. XXONM. I stood there in my church dress, keys in hand, looking at my ruined car and realizing I was trapped. I couldn't drive anywhere. I'd miss service. I'd have to spend my Sunday cleaning up someone else's accident. And that's when I understood something fundamental about what was happening. This wasn't just about the money I'd refused to lend. This was about power. Melissa was showing me that she could disrupt my life anytime she wanted, and there was nothing I could do about it. She was teaching me a lesson about crossing her. But as I stood there, sticky residue dripping from my car onto the driveway, I felt something shift inside me. Harold had always told me I was stronger than I gave myself credit for. He'd said I had a spine of steel wrapped in velvet. Maybe it was time to find that steel. I cleaned my car methodically, documenting the mess with photos before washing it away. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and really looked at the folder I'd been keeping. 3 weeks of incidents, 3 weeks of harassment, 3 weeks of a grown woman terrorizing a 64-year-old widow because she couldn't get her way. Melissa thought she was dealing with a helpless old lady who would eventually cave under pressure. She thought I'd call Brian, crying and desperate, begging to loan her the money just to make the torture stop. She had no idea who she was really dealing with. She'd forgotten that I'd been married to Harold Wilson for 41 years. And Harold Wilson didn't raise his wife to be anyone's victim. It was time for Melissa to learn what happened when you pushed Sharon Wilson too far. Monday morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called in sick to my volunteer work at the community center and spent the day at the public library using their computers and free internet access. If Melissa wanted to play games, I needed to understand exactly who I was playing with. I started with the basics: social media profiles, public records, anything I could find about Melissa Crawford Wilson. What I discovered in those first few hours made my stomach turn. Melissa's Facebook page was a carefully curated showcase of luxury: designer handbags, expensive restaurant meals, spa days, shopping trips to boutiques I couldn't afford to walk into, post after post of excess, all time-stamped within the last 2 years. Before that, her posts were sparse and ordinary. I scrolled through her Instagram account, feeling like a spy in my own family's life. There was Brian, smiling uncomfortably, in photos at restaurants where a single meal cost more than my weekly grocery budget. There were pictures of their weekend getaways to wine country, their recent trip to Mexico, Melissa posing in a different designer outfit in each shot. Where was this money coming from? Brian's job at the insurance company was steady but not lucrative. Melissa's real estate career, from what I could tell, consisted more of attending networking events than actually selling houses. I spent the next 3 hours digging deeper, and what I found made me feel sick. The first red flag was the credit monitoring site. I'd helped Brian set up an account years ago when he was worried about identity theft. And I still remembered his login information. Parents remember these things even when they probably shouldn't. Brian's credit report told a story I wasn't prepared for. 3 maxed out credit cards, a personal loan for $25,000 taken out 8 months ago, another loan for $15,000 from a different bank, late payments on their car loans. Their credit score had dropped nearly 200 points in the past year. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was discovering that Melissa had opened 2 additional credit cards in Brian's name without his knowledge. Judging by the addresses listed, one sent statements to her office, another to a PO box I'd never heard of. Combined, those cards carried nearly $30,000 in debt. My son was drowning in financial quicksand, and I had a terrible feeling he didn't even know how deep it went. I printed everything I could, my hands shaking as I fed quarters into the library's ancient printer. This wasn't just about a woman who wanted cosmetic surgery. This was about a woman who had been systematically destroying my son's financial future. The house came next. The house I'd given them as a wedding gift 8 years ago, paid in full, no mortgage. My way of ensuring Brian would always have security. I'd transferred the deed to both their names, thinking I was giving them a foundation to build on. According to the county records I found online, that house now had a $180,000 mortgage against it. Melissa and Brian had refinanced my gift, pulling out every penny of equity I'd built up over the years I'd owned it. The loan documents showed the money had been taken out in 3 separate transactions over the past 18 months. The first for $75,000, labeled home improvements. The second, for $50,000, labeled debt consolidation. The third just 4 months ago, for $55,000, labeled investment opportunity. I sat back in the uncomfortable library chair, feeling like I'd been punched in the chest. The house I'd worked decades to pay off, the house I'd given them free and clear, was now leveraged to the hilt. And for what? Looking at Melissa's social media posts, I could see exactly where that money had gone. Designer clothes, luxury vacations, expensive dinners, the kind of lifestyle that looked impressive on Instagram but was completely unsustainable on their real income. But there was more. There was always more. I found the bankruptcy filing by accident, buried in a search result from Melissa's maiden name. Not her bankruptcy, but her mother's, filed 3 years ago, listing debts of over $200,000, mostly credit, cards and personal loans. In the filing, there was a mention of $50,000 in loans to family members that would never be repaid. Family members like daughters who were living beyond their means. The pattern was becoming clear. Melissa had learned this behavior somewhere: the overspending, the manipulation, the belief that other people's money was hers to use. She'd probably drained her mother's finances before moving on to mine. I printed those documents too, building a file that painted a picture I wished I'd never seen. By the time the library closed that afternoon, I had a stack of papers 3 inches thick: bank records, credit reports, mortgage documents, social media screenshots. The evidence of my daughter-in-law's financial destruction was overwhelming, but I still didn't understand the full scope of what I was dealing with until I got home and found Brian sitting in my driveway. He was leaning against his car, still in his work clothes, looking exhausted. When he saw me pull up, he walked over before I could even get out of my Honda. "Mom, we need to talk." I clutched my folder of documents tighter. "About what, honey?" "About this situation with Melissa. She's really upset about how you've been treating her, how I've been treating her. She says you've been cold to her, suspicious, making accusations about accidents." I looked at my son, really looked at him. He'd lost weight in the past few months. I realized there were dark circles under his eyes that I'd attributed to work stress. His clothes, usually neat and pressed, looked rumpled and worn. "Brian, when's the last time you looked at your credit report?" The question caught him off guard. "What? Why would you ask that? Just humor me. When's the last time you checked your credit score?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. A couple of years maybe." "Why?" "I made a decision that would change everything between us." I opened my folder and pulled out the printed credit report. "Because you need to see this." Brian's face went white as he read. I watched him scan the numbers, his lips moving silently as he tried to process what he was seeing. "This can't be right," he said finally. "Some of these accounts, I don't recognize them." The Capital One card with the $15,000 balance statements goes to Melissa's office. The Discover card with $12,000 statements goes to a P.O. box in Melissa's name. Brian sank against his car like his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. "She said she was handling our finances to take stress off me. She said she was organizing everything. She organized it all right. Organized it so you wouldn't see what she was doing." I handed him the mortgage documents next. Watching him read them was like watching someone discover they had a terminal illness. "The house," he whispered. "Our house. You gave us that house free and clear, and now it has a $180,000 mortgage against it. But where did the money go? We don't have any money. We're barely making ends meet." I handed him my phone with Melissa's Instagram account open. Designer handbags that cost more than his monthly salary. Dinners at restaurants that charged $50 for an appetizer. Spa days that cost more than most people's rent. Brian scrolled through the photos in silence, his face growing paler with each image. Finally, he handed the phone back to me. "I don't understand. Why would she do this?" That's when I realized the full extent of what I was dealing with. Brian wasn't just financially naive. He was emotionally manipulated. Melissa had convinced him that her spending was normal, that their financial struggles were just temporary setbacks, that his mother was the unreasonable one for not helping them out of their rough patch. Brian, honey, you're not in a rough patch. You're in a financial disaster, and it's not accidental. He sat on my porch steps, holding his head in his hands. What am I going to do? If this is all true, we're ruined. We'll lose everything. Looking at my son, broken and defeated on my front steps, I felt something crystallize inside me. Melissa hadn't just stolen his money. She'd stolen his confidence, his ability to see clearly, his trust in his own judgment. She'd turned him into a confused, frightened man who couldn't understand how his life had spiraled so far out of control. Brian, I said quietly, there's something else you need to know. I told him about the harassment, about the food scraps, and garbage and vandalism. I showed him the photos I'd taken, the timeline I'd documented. I watched his face change as he realized his wife wasn't just a financial predator, she was cruel. She's been doing this for weeks, I said, terrorizing me, because I wouldn't give her money for plastic surgery. Money that would have just been more fuel for the fire. Brian looked up at me with something I hadn't seen in his eyes for years. Clarity. Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know any of it. I know you didn't, honey. What do I do now? I sat down beside him on the steps, feeling the weight of all those documents in my folder. Evidence of deception, manipulation, financial abuse, evidence that could destroy his marriage but might save his future. Now, I said, we figure out how to protect what's left. But even as I said it, I was already planning something else. Something Melissa wouldn't see coming until it was too late. She'd gambled with my son's future, terrorized me in my own home, and destroyed the financial security I'd tried to give them. She thought she was dealing with an old woman who would eventually give in to her demands. She was about to learn exactly how wrong she was. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done since Harold's death. I put on my best business suit and drove downtown to see my lawyer. Margaret Thornton had handled Harold's estate and our family legal matters for over 20 years. She was sharp, practical, and had no patience for nonsense. If anyone could help me navigate what I was planning, it would be Margaret. Sharon, she said, standing to greet me in her corner office overlooking the courthouse. This is unexpected. Is everything all right? I handed her the folder I'd compiled. I need your professional opinion about a family situation. Margaret read through everything in silence, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. I watched her eyebrows rise as she reviewed the credit reports, the mortgage documents, the evidence of financial manipulation. When she reached the photos of my vandalized property, her expression hardened. This is elder abuse, she said finally. Financial and emotional. You could press charges. I don't want to press charges. Not yet. Anyway, I want to know what my options are. Margaret leaned back in her leather chair. Well, let's start with the house. You said you transferred the deed to both their names as a gift. Yes, 8 years ago when they got married. And now they've mortgaged it without consulting you. They had every legal right to do that. It's their house now. Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that made opposing attorneys nervous. Actually, Sharon, that's where you're wrong. Under state law, gifts of real property worth over a certain amount can be revoked if the recipients demonstrate ingratitude. I felt my pulse quicken. What kind of ingratitude? Harassment of the donor. Financial misconduct that harms the donor's interests. Behavior that demonstrates the recipients are unworthy of the gift. She gestured to my folder. You've documented extensive harassment. Your daughter-in-law has created fraudulent debt in your son's name, destroying his credit. I'd say you have grounds. The possibility I hadn't dared to hope for was suddenly real. I could get the house back. More than that, you could potentially void the mortgage as well, since it was taken against a property that would retroactively no longer belong to them. I sat in stunned silence, processing the implications. The house I'd given them, the house they'd leveraged from Melissa's spending sprees, could come back to me. The debt they'd created against my gift could disappear. What about the credit cards she opened in Brian's name? That's identity theft. A federal crime. Even between spouses, opening credit accounts without consent is illegal. Margaret made another note. You could report that to the authorities or use it as leverage. Leverage for what? for getting your son out of this mess without destroying his credit permanently. I thought about Brian sitting broken on my porch steps, finally understanding what his wife had done to him. He didn't deserve to have his life ruined because he'd trusted the wrong person. There's something else you should know, Margaret continued. I did some research while you were talking. Your spending patterns suggest she may be involved in something beyond just personal excess. She handed me a printout from her computer. These are the vendor payments from her credit cards. The pattern is interesting. I scanned the list. Designer stores, yes, but also cash advances, wire transfers, payments to individuals I didn't recognize. This looks like money laundering, Margaret said, or possibly funding someone else's lifestyle. Either way, it's not just about handbags and spa days. The implications made my head spin. Melissa wasn't just financially irresponsible. She might be involved in something criminal. What do you recommend? Margaret stood and walked to her window, looking down at the street below. I recommend we move very carefully and very quietly. If your daughter-in-law is as manipulative as she appears, she'll try to cover her tracks if she suspects we're investigating. So, what's the first step? We start with protecting your son. I can help him freeze his credit, dispute the fraudulent accounts, and begin the process of separating his finances from hers. But he'll need to cooperate fully. He will. He's scared and angry enough now. Good. While we're doing that, I'll begin the paperwork to revoke the house gift based on ingratitude. It's a complex process, but your documentation is excellent. I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. How long will this take? The credit cleanup. A few weeks if we move fast. The house situation. Maybe 60 to 90 days if everything goes smoothly. She turned back to me. But Sharon, you need to understand something. Once we start this process, there's no going back. Your relationship with your daughter-in-law will be over permanently. I thought about the food scraps in my garden, the garbage scattered across my lawn, the dog waste on my doorstep. Margaret, that relationship was over the moment she decided to terrorize me for not giving her money. What about Brian? That was the harder question. Brian is going to have to choose. Either he's part of this marriage that's built on lies and theft, or he's my son who deserves better. Margaret nodded approvingly. All right then, let's get started. I spent the next 3 hours in Margaret's conference room, signing documents, making sworn statements, and authorizing her to act on my behalf. By the time I left her office, the wheels were already in motion. The drive home felt different. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't dreading what I might find when I pulled into my driveway. I wasn't wondering what new humiliation Melissa had planned for me. Instead, I was planning my own moves. Brian was waiting for me, sitting on my front porch with a suitcase beside him. I left, he said simply when I got out of the car. I packed a bag and left. Can I stay here tonight? I looked at my son. Really, looked at him. For the first time in years, he looked like the boy I'd raised instead of the confused man Melissa had turned him into. Of course, you can stay. This is your home. That evening, over dinner at my kitchen table, Brian told me things that made my blood run cold. How Melissa had gradually taken over all their finances, convincing him it was to reduce his stress. How she'd told him his mother was becoming senile and paranoid, that my complaints about harassment were signs of mental decline. How she'd isolated him from his friends, convinced him that his coworkers were jealous of their lifestyle. She had me believing I was the problem, he said, pushing food around his plate. Every time something went wrong, every time we couldn't pay a bill, she made it seem like it was because I wasn't working hard enough or you weren't helping enough. She's very good at manipulation, I said. But it's not your fault that you trusted your wife. I should have seen it sooner. All the signs were there. People like Melissa are experts at hiding what they don't want you to see. I didn't tell him about Margaret's suspicions regarding money laundering. He had enough to process for one day, but I did tell him about the plan to recover the house. You can do that, really. According to Margaret, yes, the harassment alone would be grounds, but combined with the financial fraud, we have a strong case. Brian was quiet for a long moment. What happens to Melissa? That depends on how far she wants to push this. If she accepts the consequences quietly, she might avoid criminal charges. If she fights us, I didn't finish the sentence. We both knew what the alternative was. She won't go quietly, Brian said. That's not her way. Then she learned what happens when she miscalculates her opponents. That night, I lay in bed listening to Brian moving around in his old room down the hall. It was comforting to have him back in the house, but I knew this was just the beginning. Melissa would realize he was gone. She'd try to get him back, using every manipulation tactic in her arsenal. But I had advantages she didn't know about. I had Margaret working on the legal aspects. I had documentation of every crime Melissa had committed. And I had something else: patience. Melissa was used to instant gratification, immediate results. She'd terrorized me, expecting quick capitulation. But I'd learned patience in 41 years of marriage to Harold, patience that had been tested by his long illness and slow death. I could wait, I could plan, I could move piece by piece until Melissa found herself in a trap of her own making. My phone buzzed with a text message. Melissa's number. Brian, come home. We need to talk about this misunderstanding. I can explain everything. I showed the message to Brian the next morning over coffee. He read it and shook his head. Should I respond? Not yet. Let her wonder. Let her worry. People make mistakes when they're desperate. I was right. Over the next 3 days, Melissa sent 17 text messages, left 12 voicemails, and showed up at my house twice. Each contact was more frantic than the last. Brian, please call me. I love you. We can work this out. This is all a misunderstanding. Your mother is manipulating you. If you don't come home, I'll have to make some difficult decisions about our future. The threats were already starting, but I'd expected that. What I hadn't expected was the call I received on Thursday afternoon from Margaret. Sharon, we have a problem. Your daughter-in-law has filed a restraining order against you. On what grounds? She's claiming you've been harassing her, stalking her, and interfering in her marriage. She has a court date set for next Monday. I felt the familiar anger rising, but this time it was cold and focused. She's trying to flip the script. Exactly. Make herself the victim before we can expose what she's really done. But Sharon, I think she just made her biggest mistake. How so? She's put this in front of a judge. That means we get to present our evidence in court under oath. She's opened a door she probably wishes she'd kept closed. I hung up the phone and smiled for the first time in weeks. Melissa thought she was cornering me, forcing me into a defensive position. Instead, she'd just given me exactly what I needed: a public forum to destroy her completely. Game on, Melissa. Game on. The courthouse on Monday morning was busier than I'd expected. Margaret and I sat in the hallway outside the family court, reviewing our strategy one final time. I'd barely slept the night before, but it wasn't from nerves. It was from anticipation. Remember, Margaret said, adjusting her reading glasses. Let her attorney do most of the talking initially. Melissa will have coached him on her version of events. We want to hear exactly what story she's telling before we present our evidence. I nodded, clutching the expanded folder that now contained over 100 pages of documentation. In the past week, Margaret's investigator had uncovered even more disturbing information about Melissa's financial activities. The money trail led to places we hadn't expected. Brian arrived 10 minutes before our scheduled time, wearing his best suit and looking like he was walking to his own execution. You don't have to do this, honey, I told him. Margaret says my evidence is strong enough on its own. No, Mom, I need to do this. I need to tell the truth about what she did to both of us. At exactly 9 a.m., Melissa walked into the courthouse with her attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Patterson, whom I recognized from billboards around town. She was dressed conservatively, hair pulled back, minimal makeup, playing the role of the innocent victim. She didn't look at Brian or me as they passed, but I caught the slight tremor in her hands. She was nervous. Good inside the courtroom, Judge Patricia Reynolds called the case Crawford Wilson versus Wilson, petition for restraining order. Patterson stood first. Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Melissa Crawford Wilson, has been subjected to months of harassment and stalking by her mother-in-law, Sharon Wilson. This behavior has escalated to the point where Mrs. Crawford Wilson fears for her safety and well-being. I watched Melissa dab at her eyes with a tissue as Patterson painted a picture of an innocent young woman being terrorized by her vengeful mother. According to his narrative, I was angry about being refused access to my grandchildren and had begun a campaign of intimidation. Mrs. Crawford Wilson will testify that Mrs. Wilson has followed her, photographed her home, made threatening phone calls, and enlisted her son in a conspiracy to destroy her marriage. The lies were so smooth, so believable that for a moment I wondered if anyone would believe the truth. Then it was our turn. Your Honor, Margaret began. What we have here is not a case of harassment by an elderly mother-in-law. What we have is a calculated attempt by the petitioner to deflect attention from her own criminal behavior. Patterson objected, but Judge Reynolds allowed Margaret to continue. Mrs. Wilson has been the victim of a systematic campaign of elder abuse, financial fraud, and harassment that has been ongoing for months. We have extensive documentation to support these claims. Margaret called me to testify first. I walked to the witness stand feeling calmer than I had in months. This was my moment to tell the truth. Under Margaret's questioning, I methodically laid out the timeline, the request for $100,000 for cosmetic surgery, my refusal, the escalating harassment that followed. Mrs. Wilson, can you describe the nature of this harassment? Food scraps thrown in my garden. My garbage cans overturned repeatedly. Rotting vegetables left on my property. Dog waste placed on my front steps. Orange juice poured on my patio. Furniture. I could see Melissa whispering urgently to Patterson as I spoke. Did you document these incidents? Yes, I did. Margaret handed me a stack of photos. These show the damage to my property, the mess left in my yard, the vandalism to my car. Each photo was time-stamped and dated. Melissa's face grew paler as the evidence mounted. Mrs. Wilson, did you ever threaten or harass Mrs. Crawford Wilson? No, I did not. I avoided contact with her entirely after the incidents began. Patterson's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective. He tried to suggest I was a bitter old woman making up stories, but the photographic evidence was undeniable. Then Margaret called Brian. My son walked to the witness stand with his shoulders back and his head high. For the first time in months, he looked like the man I'd raised. Mr. Wilson, are you currently living with your wife? No, I am not. I moved out last week after discovering the extent of her financial crimes. Objection. Patterson jumped up. Alleged financial crimes sustained, Judge Reynolds said, but the damage was done. Margaret handed Brian a stack of documents. Are these your credit reports? Yes, they are. Can you identify any accounts on these reports that you did not personally open? Brian's voice was steady as he identified the fraudulent credit cards, the unauthorized loans, the debt that had been created in his name without his knowledge. How much total debt was created without your authorization? Approximately $45,000. A murmur went through the courtroom. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, clearly interested. Mr. Wilson, did your wife have access to your personal information that would allow her to open these accounts? Yes, she handled all our finances. She said it was to reduce my stress. Patterson objected repeatedly, but the evidence was overwhelming. Bank statements, credit applications, even recordings of phone calls Melissa had made to credit card companies, pretending to be Brian. That then came the bombshell Margaret had been saving. Your Honor, we'd like to present evidence that goes beyond the harassment of Mrs. Wilson and the identity theft against Mr. Wilson. She handed a document to the judge and copies to Patterson and Melissa. I watched Melissa's face go white as she read. What am I looking at, counselor? Bank records showing wire transfers from accounts in Mr. Wilson's name to offshore banking facilities in the Cayman Islands. Over $200,000 moved out of the country in the past 18 months. The courtroom went dead silent. Even Patterson looked shocked. Mrs. Crawford Wilson appears to have been involved in money laundering operations, using her husband's identity and credit to facilitate the movement of funds for unknown parties. Melissa stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. That's not true. I don't know anything about those transfers, Mrs. Crawford Wilson. Please sit down, Judge Reynolds ordered. But Melissa was past rational thoughts. Months of careful manipulation, of playing the victim, dissolved in an instant. This is insane. Sharon is making this up because I wouldn't let her control our lives anymore. She's a bitter old woman who can't stand that her son chose me over her. Melissa, stop talking, Patterson hissed. But she was beyond his control now. She's been harassing me for months, following me, taking pictures, trying to break up my marriage, and now she's making up stories about money laundering because she wants to destroy me. Every word she spoke was digging her deeper. Judge Reynolds watched with the expression of someone seeing a defendant implode in real time. Margaret stood calmly. Your Honor, if I may, the defendant has just admitted to being followed and photographed. I'd like to submit these photographs into evidence. She handed over the surveillance photos her investigator had taken. Melissa entering a known money laundering front business. Melissa meeting with individuals the FBI had flagged as persons of interest in financial crimes. Your Honor, Margaret continued, these photos were taken as part of a legitimate investigation into financial crimes against my client's family. They show Mrs. Crawford Wilson engaged in activities that have nothing to do with real estate sales, and everything to do with criminal enterprise. Patterson was trying desperately to control the damage, but it was too late. Melissa had revealed herself completely. Furthermore, Margaret said, we have reason to believe that Mrs. Crawford Wilson's request for $100,000 was not for cosmetic surgery, but to satisfy debts to criminal associates. She presented financial records showing Melissa's real creditors, not credit card companies or banks, but private lenders with connections to organized crime. Mrs. Crawford Wilson borrowed money from dangerous people to fund her lifestyle, then tried to extort repayment from my client's family. When Mrs. Wilson refused to be victimized, Mrs. Crawford Wilson began a campaign of harassment designed to force compliance. Judge Reynolds had heard enough. I'm denying the petition for a restraining order. Furthermore, I'm ordering all evidence presented today to be forwarded to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. She looked directly at Melissa. Mrs. Crawford Wilson, you are advised to obtain separate criminal counsel immediately. As we left the courtroom, Melissa was sobbing hysterically while Patterson tried to explain her legal jeopardy. She caught sight of Brian walking beside me and made one last desperate attempt. Brian, please, you know I love you. This is all a misunderstanding. Come home and we'll figure this out together. Brian stopped and turned to face his wife. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. Melissa, I don't know who you really are. I thought I did, but everything about our life together was built on lies. That's not true. I never lied about loving you. You stole my identity. You destroyed my credit. You terrorized my mother. You put both of us in danger with your criminal activities. He shook his head slowly. I don't know what love means to you, but it doesn't mean what it means to me. That night, back at my house, Brian and I sat in the kitchen sharing a quiet dinner. The folder of evidence was gone, turned over to the authorities. The photos of harassment were filed away. For the first time in months, my home felt peaceful. What happens now? Brian asked. Now the district attorney decides whether to prosecute. Margaret thinks they will based on the amount of money involved and us. What happens to us? I reached across the table and took my son's hand. We rebuilt. We start over. We remember what family actually means. My phone rang. Margaret's office. Sharon, I wanted to give you an update. The FBI has taken over the case. Melissa's activities were part of a larger money laundering investigation they've been conducting. She's looking at federal charges. I felt a wave of something I hadn't expected, sadness, not for Melissa, but for the waste of it all, the destruction she'd caused, the lives she'd damaged, all for money and status that were never real to begin with. There's something else, Margaret continued. They've frozen all assets connected to the money laundering, which includes the mortgage on your house. You're going to get your property back free and clear. After I hung up, I looked around my kitchen, really looked at it. For months, this had been a place of fear and stress. Now it was just my kitchen again, warm and welcoming and safe. Brian was watching me with concern. Are you all right, Mom? I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. I'm better than all right, honey. I'm free. But even as I said it, I knew this wasn't quite over. Melissa was facing federal charges, but cornered animals were dangerous. She'd lost everything, and people like her didn't go down quietly. I had a feeling the real reckoning was still to come. 3 months later, I was standing in my garden planting new rose bushes when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. The sound made me freeze for just a moment. Muscle memory from those terrible weeks of harassment still fresh in my body. But when I looked up, it was just Mrs. Peterson from next door carrying a plate of her famous oatmeal cookies. Sharon, dear, she called, walking through my gate. I thought you might enjoy these. You've been working so hard on that garden. I accepted the cookies gratefully, wiping dirt from my hands with the towel I kept nearby. The garden was coming along beautifully. I'd replanted everything Melissa had destroyed and added new sections. I'd always wanted, but never had time for when I was dealing with her chaos. "It's looking wonderful," Mrs. Peterson said, admiring the neat rows of vegetables and the explosion of color from the flower beds. "Much better than before. Much better than before." It was a phrase I'd been hearing a lot lately, and it applied to more than just my garden. The federal charges against Melissa had made the local newspaper. "Local woman charged in money laundering scheme," read the headline, along with a photo of her being led into the courthouse in handcuffs. The article detailed how she'd been part of a larger operation that had moved over $2 million through various accounts, using stolen identities and fraudulent businesses to hide the money trail. Brian's name was mentioned as a victim, not a conspirator. The FBI had determined he was genuinely unaware of his wife's criminal activities. His credit had been restored, the fraudulent debts eliminated. The house I'd given them as a wedding gift was officially mine again, the mortgage voided as part of the asset forfeiture proceedings. I'd decided to sell it. Too many bad memories. Too much pain associated with that property. The sale had gone through last week, and the proceeds were sitting in my bank account. More money than I'd ever had at one time. Financial security beyond anything Harold and I had dreamed of when we were young and struggling. But the money wasn't the real victory. The real victory was standing in my garden on a beautiful Saturday afternoon, feeling truly peaceful for the first time in years. "Sharon, you have a visitor," Mrs. Peterson said, nodding toward the driveway. I turned to see a familiar figure walking hesitantly toward my gate. Melissa, looking nothing like the polished, confident woman who had terrorized me months ago. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes wrinkled and ill-fitting. Prison had not been kind to her, even though she'd only served 6 weeks before making bail. "Hello, Sharon," she said quietly, stopping at the edge of my garden. I set down my watering can and really looked at her. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something I'd never seen in her before, genuine fear. "Melissa, I wasn't expecting you. I know I'm not supposed to be here. The restraining order, the bail conditions, but I had to talk to you." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence before she went to federal prison for the next 5 to 10 years. That's what her plea bargain looked like, according to Margaret. "What do you want, Melissa?" She looked around my garden, taking in the healthy plants and the obvious care I'd put into restoring what she'd destroyed. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I want to apologize." I waited, saying nothing. In the months since the court hearing, I'd imagined this moment many times. I'd thought I'd feel triumphant, vindicated, satisfied by her downfall. Instead, I felt surprisingly empty. "I know sorry doesn't fix anything," she continued. "I know I can't take back what I did to you, to Brian, to our family, but I need you to know that I understand now how wrong I was. Do you? Do you really understand?" She nodded, tears starting to fall. "I destroyed everything good in my life because I couldn't stop wanting more. More money, more status, more of everything. And when you wouldn't give me what I wanted, I turned into someone I don't even recognize. I thought about the woman who had dumped rotting food in my garden, who had left dog waste on my doorstep, who had terrorized a 64-year-old widow for refusing to finance her vanity. You didn't turn into someone you don't recognize, Melissa. You revealed who you really were." The words hit her like a physical blow. She actually staggered backward, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to hold the pieces together. "You're right," she whispered. "You're absolutely right, and I hate myself for it." We stood in silence for a long moment. Birds chirped in the trees Harold had planted. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the new rose bushes. The world continued its peaceful rhythm, indifferent to our human drama. "What do you want from me, Melissa?" "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." I nodded. Double quotes. "Do you think Brian will ever forgive me?" The question caught me off guard. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I hadn't expected her to ask it. "No," I said gently. "I don't think he will." She closed her eyes, more tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't think so, but I had to ask." "Melissa, can I ask you something?" She nodded. "Was any of it real? Your marriage to Brian, the life you built together?" She was quiet for so long that I thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with regret. In the beginning, yes, I did love him in my own broken way. But somewhere, along the line, I started loving what he could give me more than who he was. The house you gifted us, the security, the respectability. I got addicted to the lifestyle and lost sight of the person. It was the most honest thing I'd ever heard her say, and when I realized Brian couldn't fund the life I wanted, I started looking for other sources. The money laundering, it started small, just moving some cash for people who paid well. But it grew and grew, until I was in so deep I couldn't see a way out except to ask you for that loan. And when I said no, when you said no, I felt like you were destroying my last chance to save myself, so I tried to destroy you back. The admission hung between us like a confession in church. Raw, painful, and necessary. Melissa, you were never going to save yourself with my money. You were just going to dig the hole deeper. I know that now. But then I was drowning, and I thought anyone who wouldn't throw me a life preserver was the enemy. I looked at this broken woman standing in my garden, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt something approaching pity for her. What happens now? I asked. Now I go to prison. My lawyer says 5 years minimum, maybe 8. Everything I own has been seized by the government, my car, my jewelry, even my clothes. I'm staying in a shelter until sentencing next week. The woman who had flaunted designer handbags and expensive dinners was homeless, facing years in federal prison. The karmic justice was almost too perfect. What about after prison? She shrugged hopelessly. I'll be a 40-year-old ex-convict with no money, no skills that aren't connected to crime, and no family. I don't know what happens after prison. Despite everything she'd done to me, I found myself feeling sorry for her. Not enough to forgive her, not enough to help her, but enough to recognize the human tragedy of it all. Melissa, there's something I need to tell you. She looked up hopefully. What you did to me, the harassment, the cruelty, the way you tried to terrorize me into giving you money, that changed me. It made me realize I'd spent too many years being accommodating, being the nice mother-in-law who never caused problems. Her face fell. You taught me that being kind doesn't mean being weak, that sometimes you have to fight back, that sometimes you have to protect yourself, even if it means destroying someone else's life. Sharon, please, let me finish. You asked for my forgiveness. I want you to understand exactly what you're asking for. I stepped closer to her, close enough to see the fear in her eyes. You didn't just steal money or harass an old woman. You tried to break my spirit. You tried to make me doubt my own worth, my own judgment, my own reality. You wanted me to believe I was nothing more than a source of funding for your delusions. She was crying openly now, mascara running down her cheeks. And when I fought back, when I refused to be your victim, you discovered something you never expected. You discovered that the quiet old lady you'd been tormenting was stronger than you ever imagined. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is a cashier's check for $10,000. Her eyes widened in confusion. It's not for you, I continued. It's for the women's shelter where you're staying. A donation in your name. Because even though I can't forgive what you did to me, I won't let you be homeless. She stared at the check, then at me, completely bewildered. I don't understand. You probably never will. That's the difference between us, Melissa. When I have power over someone, I choose mercy. When you had power over me, you chose cruelty. I handed her the check. Give this to the shelter director. Tell them it's to help women who've lost everything, learn to rebuild their lives. She took the check with shaking hands. Why? Because that's who I am. That's who I choose to be, and no amount of harassment or abuse was ever going to change that. I turned and walked back toward my house, leaving her standing in my garden, holding the check. Sharon, wait, she called. I paused but didn't turn around. Will you tell Brian? Will you tell him I'm sorry for everything? I'll tell him you came by, I said. What I tell him beyond that will depend on whether you actually use that money to help other people or find a way to spend it on yourself. I heard her car door close a few minutes later, heard the engine start and fade into the distance, stood at my kitchen window, watching my garden in the afternoon light, and realized I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Real, genuine, unshakable peace. Brian came over for dinner that evening, as he had every Sunday since moving back in with me temporarily. He was doing well, had been promoted at work, and was seeing a therapist to help him process the emotional manipulation he'd endured. Most importantly, he was learning to trust his own judgment again. Mom, Mrs. Henderson said she saw Melissa here today. I told him about the conversation, about the apology, about the donation I'd made to the shelter. You gave her money. I gave the shelter money. There's a difference. Brian was quiet for a long moment. Do you think she meant it? The apology. I think she meant it in the moment. Whether she mean it next week or next year, I don't know. But that's not my concern anymore. Are you going to forgive her? I thought about the question. Really thought about it. Forgiveness isn't something you give to other people, honey. It's something you give to yourself. I've already forgiven her, not because she deserves it, but because carrying that anger was making my life smaller. Brian smiled. The first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. Dad would be proud of you. I think he would be proud of both of us. We survived something that could have destroyed our family, and we came out stronger. As Brian helped me clean up after dinner, I thought about the journey from that terrible night when Melissa had first asked for money to this peaceful evening in my restored home. The woman who had tried to terrorize me into compliance had instead awakened something in me I didn't know existed, the ability to fight back with both strength and grace. My house was mine again. My son was healing. My garden was blooming. And I was free. Truly free. For the first time in years, Melissa had taught me something valuable, though not in the way she'd intended. She'd taught me that quiet strength, properly applied, was more powerful than all her manipulation and cruelty combined. Tomorrow, she would face sentencing. Tomorrow, she would begin paying the real price for her choices. But tonight, I was at peace in my home, surrounded by the life I'd built through patience, wisdom, and the courage to say no when saying yes would have destroyed me. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.